think at the moment we have a problem where a lot of the work is not being focused on problems that have good clinical impact. It's very hard for computer scientists and doctors to collaborate with each other effectively. And I feel like that needs to happen in order for people with the right technical expertise to work on problems that have real clinical impact, because genuinely a lot of people with the technical skills just have no idea about the actual impactful problems in practice. Yeah, so I think I would encourage people as much as possible to be bold in your decision making, and for me that meant constantly putting myself out of my comfort zone. If you want to you're interested in entrepreneurial stuff, or you're coming from a technical background but you want to move into healthcare, like try and put yourself in as much situations as possible where you're surrounded by people with the expertise that you want to gain a mentor specifically in the field that you're not comfortable in, rather than the one that you're coming from. And
All right. So, hello and welcome everyone to whoever's listening to this particular podcast. Today we have with us Emma Rocheteau. Emma is a final year medical student at the University of Cambridge and also pursuing her Ph.D. in machine learning with a focus on applications for healthcare. With her knowledge of clinical decision making, she's working on research projects that leverage machine learning techniques to improve clinical workflows, and more than that. She'll be taking her role as an academic doctor post her graduation. Emma, it's nice to have you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm very excited.
So you have a background in medical science prior to doing your PhD in machine learning. And also you have a bit of a background in your engineering. And so what was your interest point in AI? Like, how did you first learn about AI, and what got you most interested to pursue like a degree, like PhD in machine learning post that?
I think to answer this question properly, I probably have to go a bit further back than when I was even originally considering PhDs, because it feels like I've kind of sort of stumbled into this area rather than an intentional route towards it. So originally when I was applying for university, I applied for medicine. And at the time, I had a little bit of doubt in my mind, because when I was studying at school, I really enjoyed maths and physics, and they were my most strong, but also the subjects that I enjoyed the most. And actually, when I started the medicine course in Cambridge, in the first week, I got doubts. I initially was thinking, oh no, I might have picked the wrong course. And I was suddenly very jealous of my friends doing engineering. And I thought, I think I should change course. So I actually contacted the head of engineering in my college to ask, is there a possibility that I could change course? And then he did a interview of me, almost like I was an undergrad applying for the subject, all in the first week of university, and looked at my results, and then finally said, okay, we're happy for you to join the engineering course. And then I got cold feet and then didn't, because I'm thinking, this feels too rushed, maybe I should try medicine. I don't want to ask myself what if questions and think that I panicked in my first week and then changed. So anyway, I continued with medicine. I did the first 2 years of the course. And by the end of the second year, I'd done fairly well, and I'm thinking maybe this is the right fit for me. I'm not sure. I really enjoyed learning about all the topics. And then in Cambridge, they give you the opportunity to do a year of a different subject in your third year. So most of the time, this is something related to medicine. But for me, I thought, now's my chance to finally go and do engineering for a year and see, is this what I should have been doing all along? And that's what I did. And I really, really enjoyed that year. That was the first exposure that I had to any kind of advanced maths, but also any sort of programming as well. Because before my third year of university, I thought I was like a technophobe. I thought that I just couldn't use computers. I was the one who was sort of asking my friends, how to use Excel? I don't even know how to do do formulas in Excel or even make graphs or anything. I just had this impression of myself that I just couldn't work with computers and that it was beyond me and too difficult. So that year sort of turned my perspective a little bit, because I realized that actually computer science is not like, it's a lot of sort of problem solving and logic, and that kind of skills is actually a lot more similar to the mathematical side of things that I enjoyed than any kind of like I don't know, hardware stuff. I think I just had like the wrong impression of what it meant. So basically that was the first time that kind of opened my eyes to perhaps I should be looking at kind of technology, and that kind of thing might fit me. So yeah. Do you want me to carry on telling you like how I got to the PhD in the end, or?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, just to comment on that, like it's a very, very interesting story. Like a lot of people, and it's very interesting. Like what you're gonna say next is like basically like you coming from a background where you had troubles understanding like just the basic technical details of working with these skills, but you're on spot on understanding like computer science is much more on the mathematical framework and using those knowledge to maybe program. Like programming is just a tool like computer science students use to solve a problem, but it is not much on the sector of like computer engineering where you have to learn the nitty-gritty details of how a computer works. It's much more on what you build on top of that. But yeah, I'll let you continue. Like how did you go from learning Excel to learning AI?
Well, as part of the engineering course, we had to do like a couple of projects that involved sort of like a programming language called MATLAB. And so I just had to do some basic MATLAB. I actually did ask for a lot of help from my friends, because at the time, the other people doing the course had used it before and I hadn't. So I felt a bit kind of like, oh, this is very strange. Why can't I click undo? And like just all the stuff that you get confused by when you're first learning to program. But actually towards the end of that year, there was an organization in the university called Code First Girls, which was targeted at particularly getting sort of women and other genders involved in learning to code. And that was a real breakthrough for me, because I think there was just something a bit less intimidating about that, and you've been very honest about me being a beginner. And so I joined that, and we actually made a website. So it was actually HTML initially. So and then later on we moved on to Python. And that was when I was sort of really opened my eyes to the possibilities, because when I first learned a little bit of Python, I was like, wow, like this tool is super cool. We can make anything with this. And then I started signing up to like any hackathon that I could hear about in the local area in London. I was sort of traveling the country to go to various hackathons. I must have gone to about 10 or 11 in the preceding year. So yeah, like it was kind of that was what really opened my interest, was that year in engineering. And I also did a summer project at the end of that year, which was in Oxford, and I did about 12 weeks of a computational project where I was analyzing data from ferret brains, actually. But it was like a purely computational project. So that also gave me more exposure to MATLAB as well. And so I had the opportunity to kind of learn in a bit more detail as to how I would use these kind of tools. And so after that year, I went back to medicine. I actually did the first clinical year of the course. So another thing I should explain about Cambridge is they have this fairly unique, although apparently in the US it's more common, but in the UK it's called the MV PhD course. And in the US, I think there's a similar thing called the MD PhD. And so I applied for that, but that's kind of quite unique, because if they grant you a place, they give you funding, but you don't have to say what PhD you're going to do. So they actually give you funding for 3 years to do any PhD, and then you go to different labs and say, I have money to do a PhD, would you consider me? Yeah, which is kind of, so I applied for that thinking I'm interested in research. I don't really know what it is that I'm interested in. I hadn't narrowed it down to technology. I still thought I might want to do bioengineering or something a lot more, maybe mechanical engineering involving biomaterials or something like that. I really had no idea. But I applied for that program and was successful. And that's when I then spent, so during that clinical year, when I was on placement, I was also visiting various PhD labs, trying to figure out like what I might use these 3 years for. And that then leads me on to after about 10 or 12 labs, I finally found what would be my future PhD supervisor, an Italian called Pietro Leo. And he was so enthusiastic about me. Like, I can't really explain how, like, what it was like, because I feel like when I was applying for all these technical PhDs, I just got the feeling quite often when I'd approach a potential supervisor, they would then ask me, right, so you've got 1 year of technical expertise, like already, and that's kind of 1 year of engineering. You mainly did mechanical engineering. Let's face it, you've not done any programming. And they're just looking at me like, are you serious kind of thing. But this guy, like my future PhD supervisor, was just like, he was so motivated to make it work. Like I could tell he was so enthusiastic to work with me. He was immediately trying to introduce me to all the other lab members. And I just got this feeling that, I should go for it. I should try and do this PhD in the computer science department and go into the kind of technology end of medicine. So that's kind of how it happened, but it wasn't very intentional. And it was kind of like I mainly sent out cold emails to several labs without really knowing what it was that I was going for. So hopefully that vaguely answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does, and I think it's like a very inspiring and unique story, because for most of the people, even coming from a computer science background, it's very hard to get off started like in a very researchy field, which especially like AI. Like most of the people are intimidated by the mathematics and programming that's needed by that particular field or those particular works. So I think it's really interesting and motivating. Like you coming from like you said, like you just had like a very basic level of 1 year of experience working with MATLAB, which is a very small subsection of what programming needs for AI. But yeah, I think the motivation, and it's good to, like, to be honest, I didn't know like US offers that particular program like MD plus PhD. But yeah, I mean, I don't have a medical background, so I have never explored that particular field of what's being offered. But that's pretty cool. Like pursuing 2 degrees, that's completely like, I mean, there's an intersection for sure, but the almost least overlap between 2 fields, but they still promote. So that's good to know. But I wanted to learn, like, so like you said, like again, you started off in a very from scratch domains. Like you did not have like an extensive training in, let's say, computer science degrees or something like that. So how did you go about learning the basics? So like once you're in this lab, you joined for your PhD, like how did you go about, like was that like a very intimidating process or overwhelming process to learn the basics of how do you train models on GPU, what are these machine learning models, what exactly they are doing, and lots of other things? How did you go about learning the basics?
Yeah, I mean, that was a very uphill struggle for me. In fact, even getting the place on the PhD, because even though I had funding, that's one step. I didn't have like an acceptance to the department. So before I could even properly apply, I did some courses on Coursera. I think now it's quite well known that there's a course by, I think it's Andrew Ng, that's like Introduction to Machine Learning. It might have changed now, but at the time that I did it, it was 2000 and early 2017. And so I did that, and I also did a couple of other courses and tried to sort of teach myself to program, because I had a very, very, very basic Python understanding. I had no idea what objects and classes were at the time. Like it was really, really, really basic. So I was going on sort of code wars, trying to do like the problems that they have there in Code Academy and everything. But it's really hard to motivate yourself, I think, without a project. So I didn't really get that far before I started my PhD. And then once I started the PhD, I didn't really know anyone very well. I was not doing the same work as the other people in the lab initially. And also my supervisor was actually on sabbatical for at least the first term, maybe the first 2 terms. So I pretty much had, like, I was there in the department, and I actually remember I broke my operating system twice in the first week because I uninstalled Python from a Linux machine, which I realized is an integral part of the operating system now. So I remember the system admin coming upstairs, looking at me like, "How did you get into this department? You know, you're." I could just tell what he was thinking. But yeah, I'd say that the biggest help is really to find yourself a mentor in the area so someone to look up to. If you can think, I would like to be like you in 3-4 years time, I think that's an ideal person to be a mentor. And I found someone who was like that in my lab. He's quite well known now, so it always feels like I'm name dropping him now, but back then, so his name is Petar Velichkovich, and he now sort of works in graph neural networks and DeepMind. But back then, you know, he hadn't even published his gap paper then and stuff, and he was still very keen to teach people. And, you know, basically he helped me so much. Like, he patiently sat me down, showed me what Keras was, because back then that's what we were using, not PyTorch. And yeah, and then basically kind of helped me to get my first ever LSTM running. And, you know, just to see, I remember at the time it felt like the biggest thing. I was like, wow, like I'm running something on a GPU and it's like giving me predictions. And, you know, I wasn't doing anything groundbreaking, but I think just step by step, having a mentor there and having a project, like having an idea in your mind, like I have this data and I want to give it this input and this output and see what the results are. And I think that is very helpful, rather than just kind of a very imprecise goal, like I just want to teach myself to program. Is kind of, you have to do things stepwise and have like a clear goal in mind at all times, I think. And yeah, so basically the first 1 to 2 years of my PhD really felt like I was stumbling around with very little direction, and it felt like there's just no way that I'm going to get this PhD in the end. I'm so far behind. And, you know, just comparing myself to other people on the program as well, who were just super accomplished, publishing in Europe in their first year, you know, which is fairly standard there, but like for me was just so far off. Yeah. But I think it was just, I don't know, I think maybe even when it was sort of really hard, I just had this belief in myself that I would make it work in the end. And I'm not sure where that came from, but luckily kept me going.
Yeah, no, what you said makes sense. And one of the key things that you mentioned was like losing like a sense of direction, right? So that's pretty common. And that's one of the reasons why even I started this particular channel, was that like a lot of people normally feel that particular sense of direction lacking in machine learning fields, because this field pretty of started in like maybe less than a decade ago, and like the interest in this field has been growing like at an exponential rate. And most of the times, like there are not many good courses or graduate courseworks, or maybe like I would say like a degree course that takes you from point A to point B, like starting from scratch. So most of the time people end up learning from themselves. It's like self-paced, learning what needs to be learned. And like you said, like, yeah, having a mentor really helps, because most of the times, like when you learn from someone's mistakes, or maybe like what not to do, or what not to waste your time on, that's like a big time saver for like at least few months. And that's why even like how I learned, like from like it was not basically like a mentor, but like more like a student who was like a senior PhD student. So he would tell me, don't waste your time learning these tools, like just go on, like that would be much more useful. You don't have to be the best programmer, like you don't have to like write the most optimized code to run your machine learning models, but focus on these tools, focus on these techniques. So I think, yeah, it makes sense. And like courses like what you said, like by Andrew Yang, like they are like the holy grail for someone to get started, because there are only limited resources you can stumble on, and it's one of the least confusing ones. So yeah, it makes sense what you said. But coming to the question, so yeah, now you're in your lab. Like I'm just picturing like your timeline. So now you're in your lab, and you pretty much decided like you want to work on research projects that combine maybe your clinical knowledge, your medical knowledge, and that complements your skills as an AI researcher. So let me break down these set of questions one by one, and maybe to understand from someone who has been like working in this field for a long time, what do you think is the promise of AI in the medical research community? Like a lot of people talk about like using AI for good or maybe AI for social good purposes. But what do we mean when we say like what if someone tells you why should, if I'm a person from medical background, like why should I care about AI? So in loose terms, like what do you think is the biggest promise of AI in medical community?
Interesting question. I think you've phrased it quite positively, which is interesting. And I probably would count myself in the camp where I'm generally excited about the introduction of AI. But I also think if I was coming at it from a medical perspective, I think it's also important to have a healthy amount of skepticism as well. In terms of the positives, I think there's lots of ways that AI has the potential to make care for patients better. So I think, well, one example could be that perhaps making certain processes within the hospital more efficient. Perhaps being able to check patients kind of more frequently and evaluate their risk of developing a certain adverse complication, like more basically. So sort of doing some of the monitoring of patients, especially in sort of the high dependency unit and that kind of thing. It might also help us to personalize care to patients, because at the moment in medicine, we kind of have these treatment protocols that are a bit more one size fits all. So we have like an asthma protocol for children and adults, and the two different ones, but that's it. It's just whether a child or an adult. But actually, I think AI has the potential to, in a kind of data-driven way, to personalize treatment for different kinds of patients that should make treatments better, I think, overall. It might also make medicine safer, because at the moment, like, human error is huge in medicine. I don't actually know the statistic on what percentage of drug prescriptions are errors, but it would shock you, I think, if you actually knew. And I think, having AI kind of preside over the prescriptions and flag anything that's like, I'm not sure about this one. Like there's lots of examples where I think it could also just improve efficiency and make certain services cheaper, like for instance screening. So obviously a lot of applications that are actually being deployed at the moment are in the kind of radiology type specialties or histopathology or something that's very image focused, because I think that's the 1/2 areas. Maybe you could count language now, which is really becoming big at the moment, but I'd say image was the first domain where we kind of achieved human-like performance, I'd say, with AI compared to humans. And so that was kind of the most obvious field that was going to become implemented first. So I think something like if you're doing a breast screening program, and at the moment, if we're having every image checked by, say, 2 clinicians, we could have an AI be one of the checks, and that's going to improve kind of efficiency and reduce the workload. So that means we can screen more people or offer it to younger people maybe, or more often or something. So I think there's a lot of exciting possibilities. I think with a lot of technology, it's kind of like a lot of people are going to, let me get this the right way around, overestimate its short-term effect. So I think people think it's going to completely transform medicine in the next 5 years, which I would be like, I think medicine will be not that different in 5 years, but I think people will underestimate its long-term effects. So if you're looking 50 years, I think it might be completely transformative. And I think some doctors are a bit wary of that, because they're thinking, is AI going to take over my job? And I don't really think that's the case. I feel like it will alter the role of the doctor a bit, I think, because almost like AI is it's very good at tasks that involve kind of analysing data. And a lot of the job currently of a doctor is to take into account certain data types. And I think sort of, if you imagine like AI as an extension to a clinician's brain, you can think of like the data crunching center being like one part of the job that maybe might be less important for a clinician in the future, but actually providing the direct care to patients, explaining treatment plans to them, taking into account patients' own preferences and what's going to work around their lifestyle, examining, like all these things are much, much harder for AI to achieve. So to just say AI is going to take over the role of a doctor is not, like, I feel like it really distills the role of a doctor down to something that I think is not accurate. And yeah, like doctors aren't just data crunching centers really, but they are decision makers. And I still think that's going to be the case, because even if AI is brilliant at doing the data interpretation part of the job, it's still down to the doctor to actually make the decision in the interest of the patient or with the patient, because only they can sort of incorporate the patient's preferences and all of these other factors and the realistic factors of how we're going to actually achieve the treatment plan. And also, maybe this is my cynical side coming in, but if you think of how AI is developed, like especially in medicine, and because there's such a high barrier to implementation, I feel like at the moment it's mainly sort of private companies that are making, AI products which are going to be ultimately deployed, because it's very hard for academia to achieve that kind of thing with far less resources. And so, if we've got private companies making these products, ultimately they need to make a profit. And I feel like, at least in the UK, clinicians are the ones that are best positioned to make ultimate decisions for patients, because they're the ones who, it's the patient's health interest that is truly in their own interests. So I think it's also the doctor's duty in the future to safeguard patients from potential harmful impacts of AI. For example, invading privacy, just because social media data or GPS data taken from patients with mental health problems or something, just because that's informative doesn't mean we should use it and that it's in their interest. And, protecting that data, I think, biased models as well, making sure that models are safe to be deployed for the patients, I think is also very much the role of the doctor. So I don't know, coming back to your original question, what's like, I guess, why should I be interested in AI as a doctor? I think just like, if I had no expertise in it, I would definitely take something seriously that I felt was going to have a significant impact on my future job in 20 years. And I think a lot of doctors, they kind of fall into perhaps two camps, where one think, oh, there's no way it could do the job that I do. Like, that's ridiculous. There's so much hype, but it never comes to fruition. Versus maybe a few doctors that are in the younger camps that have maybe tampered with ChatGPT a bit, and they think, oh no, like this is going to completely take over the job. And actually, I think the truth is somewhere in between, and it's going to be a more slow evolution, I think. Because if we think back to the introduction of any new technology in medicine, I think it always felt like a superpower at the time to be able to, look inside people's bodies and do all this really cool stuff that we've never been able to do. But in the end, it doesn't change like the heart of what the role is, which is to, improve the health of patients and provide care to patients. I don't think that's going to change the essence of what it means. So, yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just to add on that, like, last year I attended one of these conferences called McKay, which is like a perfect intersection of people coming from AI domain and medical domain, like clinicians who operate in these settings. And there was one of the debates, like, is AI ready for primetime use in medical research? And this was just like a debate for fun, but there were some very nice points that maybe I still remember on these lines. Is someone said that you should use or maybe see AI as more like a productivity tool for medical researchers rather than someone who can replace them. So like what you said, like most of the times when technology was introduced, like sometime back when they had like the digitalization for these medical institutes, it did not replace them, or like it did not change the way medical researchers would or medical experts would operate, but it will enhance them. And what you said for the scale is really true. Like there were actually a few startups, in fact, from UK, who claimed that like actually it helps doctors reach particular regions or maybe particular set of patients that they could not, like let's say if I'm looking for 5 patients in a day, I'm a practicing doctor, then now I can at least see 8 patients because these tools make my life easier. Or maybe the error, like if I'm able to make errors in a very extreme scenario where I'm going through something and my head is not in the right space, these tools would basically help me. So it's more like what we have for self-driving. It's not going to replace them, but yeah, it's like if you have a bad day, it's good to have like an autopilot that can make you those little decisions that can save your life. So it's more like how we interpret these technologies. Like you said, like once it's released, we always are very fearful or very skeptical about it. But yeah, I think, and one of the key things that maybe I want to probe you more on, like, do you ever, so you said like it perfectly, like the points that you mentioned are perfectly fair, that we should be skeptical about the privacy and like the intrusion of what these tools can do you think one of the other skepticism is like AI being like black box models? Like, do these feels like if I am able to deploy a model that can perform very well on the predefined metrics, like normally how we define metrics, like okay, these are the evaluation scores for these models. But do you think these kind of models face a problem of interpretability or explainability of these models when they are deployed in the real world?
That is a very difficult question to answer because, well, first of all, I'd just say disclaimer that I'm not an expert on interpretability, and it's not really an area that I've worked that much in. But in terms of like, if you're asking my personal opinion from my experience of working in hospitals, how important is it, or how much of a barrier is it? I feel like my opinion shifted on this in the last couple of years, because I feel like if you'd have asked me 3 years ago, is it important for models that are going to be deployed in hospitals to be explainable? I would have probably said, well, yeah, because otherwise, how can we trust their decisions? Like, it's going to help us sort of pick up perhaps biases in the models, because if you're noticing that the explanation doesn't make any sense for maybe certain ethnicities or something like that, then it helps you to identify these problems, I think. Now, I think, while I do take the bias point, and I think if it's in situations where the doctor disagrees with perhaps the recommendation or the evaluation of risk that this particular model is given, that it would be helpful, yes. But do I think in most cases you actually need an explanation for a lot of models? I would actually say no, because already doctors use a lot of tools to make decisions. Like, for example, a lot of protocols or treatment regimens in England rely on certain risk scoring. So let's say so Q risk is one type of risk scoring that I think evaluates the risk of getting a heart problem in the next 10 years or something like that. And then based on that, we might give certain treatments to people whose Q risk is more than 10% or something like that. And, doctors never, ever break down the Q risk score and think, why is it come up with a risk of 10%? Even though it's literally just crunching particular numbers and it's a very simple scoring tool. I actually think a lot of the time, if you replace these sort of scoring tools with more accurate models, I don't think it would add anything to give it an explanation. I think what would be more helpful is to add an uncertainty to it, perhaps if it was a reliable uncertainty, because then you could maybe identify an area where the model's not sure. But actually, I think explainability could be more important not at the individual patient level, but maybe just more when you're thinking about, is this a model that is safe to deploy or not? So maybe in the regulatory phase or approval phase, maybe then it would be useful, because then you can probe the model. And yeah, but in terms of, do I think the average clinician needs an explainable decision? Like, for the vast majority of use cases, I actually think not. I'm surprised that my opinion's changed on this, but genuinely, I think being close to being a doctor now, I'll be a practicing doctor in about 5 or 6 months, which is quite scary. Am I going to take the time to really think about the reasons behind a lot of these risk things? Probably not. I'm just going to take the number and use it to then execute my treatment plan. So, yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because I'll share maybe just few points on this, because it's similar, the same trajectory I had for me. So when I started my PhD, I reached out to my professor, and she said I'll give you a few months, decide a topic that you might want to focus on, so that I can focus you on certain projects. And my first idea that I had was maybe developing along the lines of title of interpretable AI models for medical diagnosis. And she thought, okay, I'll maybe put you on projects that can help you decide these kind of thesis direction. And it's similar to what you said. Fast forward at least 2.5 years, I am not that much interested into interpretable AI, as in, and this comes from a variety of factors. One being, yes, the methods that we have already out there, they do not in some cases they do have a value of using these kind of explainable models, but they do not typically add to the application domain. So yes, I can use GradCam based approaches to see where the model is looking, but do those things really help me? But if I talk to, because I work with a lot of neurologists over here, and they normally typically work with brain scans, and we have published few works that use GradCam based approaches to explain these decisions. But they would be rather interested in having an AI model that can classify, and maybe least care about the things that the model can tell me that, oh, it's looking at this region, fine, that's okay. It's more like a shrug that, oh, it's good, it tells me, but it doesn't really add a clinical value. And a few of the other things. So I think last guest I had was she worked on transformer models for large language models, and few of the things that have been discovered or maybe known in research communities, most of these models try to find these shortcut knowledges. So I mean, something like AlphaGo, right? So these kind of models are trained on big models, they are highly sophisticated networks, and they do find some kind of value in the application or whatever it is trying to do, like transform models on large language models, or reinforcement learning models, how it was deployed in AlphaGo. They normally find these shortcuts to knowledges, and they do not translate well to human knowledge. So even if the model tells me I did this decision because of XYZ, that was the explanation, that explanation is least understandable by humans. But that's the thing, it complements us, right? It doesn't mean that it has to align with my explanations or my way of belief, but it performs well. That's good, because it maybe learns something better than me. So yeah, I agree to that. Interpretable or explainability, I'm not that much a pro person for that. But it's surely interesting when I think there are lots of government regulations being put in place with these models, and they definitely have a point of proving these models are not biased. So yeah, understanding if the data, it can tell you if the model the data you used for the model training was biased or not. So those kind of sanity checks can be used from these kind of methods. But yeah, sorry for the long rhetorical, but yeah, I agree what you said, and it's really important. But one thing I wanted to pick from what you said was along the lines of what you suggested was, maybe using these uncertain sets, so as in making more of a useful, making a set of problems that are much more useful, rather than working on problems that do not add a value in the real world. So in your experience, do you feel as a community, when people try to use AI models for any kind of clinical applications, people pick a data and just apply AI model and publish those results saying that, oh, we found some correlations, this is the model accuracy. But most of these times do not reflect added value in the clinical research or medical research community. So what would you say, how do you find problems that are useful to work on, so that it has a positive output to the existing literature in clinical research. First of all, how do you find these problems? And secondly, do you feel this is more than often that people work on problems not really making any sense, but they just publish out like just to prove a point? So how, first of all, like, do you see this is a happening thing in the community? And secondly, how do you identify useful problems to work on?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And it's one that I probably think about quite a lot. I do think the vast majority of research that's done is on problems that have very limited or no clinical impact, which is quite sad when you think about it. You know, countless hours of researchers' time that's not really translating into any impact on real patients. And I think probably a lot of researchers overestimate the clinical impact of their work. They might think, oh, like if I'm working on a model which is going to predict dementia early, like, you know, if I find potential cases of Parkinson's disease early, they probably think it's going to be revolutionary. And then when you realize that actually, you know, the treatment for a lot of these things, maybe that's a bad example. I mean, you know, it might be that diagnosing these conditions early is, you know, yeah, but something like Huntington's disease, for example, we don't really have like much in the way of treatments to alter the course of the disease. And I'd say for most dementias, it's kind of similar. So the fact that we might be able to diagnose it 2 years earlier is probably not going to make that much difference to those patients. And that's if it were deployed, which is also a big if, because the vast majority of projects never get deployed in real practice. And that's kind of because they don't really have like much of a clinical impact if they were to be deployed. So yeah, I think at the moment we have a problem where a lot of the work is not being focused on problems that have good clinical impact. And to some extent, I feel like I'm also, like, I'm not saying that I've spent my PhD work on really impactful problems, because a lot of the time, like, I have not deployed any of my models either in real practice. I mean, I'm hoping that in 2 years' time, I'll actually will deploy one of my models in a real hospital. But so far, I think because of my PhD and the fact that I'm so early in my career, I kind of am in the phase of focusing on building my skill set more than anything, so that later on in my career I can then make real clinical impact. So right now, like, not everyone's goal could be to make the maximum clinical impact. I totally get that PhD students might be more interested in, you know, publishing at the right venues and developing their own skill set and career capital and everything, and I get it. Which also highlights another point, which I think is that the way that sort of the way that research is set up at the moment and academia works is sort of to give us the wrong incentives anyway, but that's a whole different conversation. Yeah. In terms of finding impactful problems to work on, that is really tough, because I think at the moment, so one of the things that I've very much noticed in the past few years of working at the intersection of these fields is that it's very hard for computer scientists and doctors to collaborate with each other effectively. And I feel like that needs to happen in order for people with the right technical expertise to work on problems that have real clinical impact, because genuinely a lot of people with the technical skills just have no idea about the actual impactful problems in practice. Yeah, I'm still the only one in the room that's thinking, I know what both of these groups of people are talking about, and I wish that I would just be like, you know, somebody is the technical people are totally misunderstanding understanding what the doctors are saying, and the doctors just have no idea like what they're even asking and what the limitations of AI are. And this meeting is just not a productive one. So it's really, really challenging. I feel like in order to collaborate effectively, you need some knowledge in the other domain to be able to work with those people, if that makes sense. So I feel like we need to establish like a cohort of clinicians, especially because I think that's the area that's really lacking on a lot of these projects. We have the technical expertise that we can deploy, but a lot of the time we just lose that clinical voice. Like in the project design phase, there's no clinical input because that's often the thing that gets missed, I think. So we need sort of clinicians who have a bit of a special interest in AI we need a way that they can become involved in the process of developing these models, I think, but not just in a way where Google approaches a group of doctors and they say, yeah, sure, we can come to these meetings, but like they can't properly give their input because they can't really understand what's going on from the technical perspective. So yeah, I think we need education on both sides to help to bridge this gap, I think. And part of the reason why I am like still in the medical field and I've finished my medical degree and I'm going to become a doctor is because I feel like I realized towards the end of my PhD that I was really enjoying the research. I could very happily apply for a job in like a big tech company and work on these projects from a technical angle. And I would probably have a great life and I'd really enjoy it. But again, I might fall into the trap of having no clinical impact because I'm going to lose touch with the medical world. The medical world's going to move forward without me. And sure, like I can still talk to doctors, but it's not the same as being in the hospital, being frustrated by all the things that could be optimized by AI. So my plan is to literally be in the hospital with the knowledge of what AI can achieve, to then think, what problems can I see where AI would just be the right solution for? And a lot of these problems are kind of hidden away in specialties where like it's very hard to see in if you're not already in that world, if that makes sense. So there's not an easy answer to that. The short answer is it's very difficult right now, and we need to bridge the gap, which is a very big gap at the moment.
Yeah, no, I love what you said, like how you ended this particular thing. And I think we need more people like that because, like, from my own experience, because since most of my PhD is focused on using AI for healthcare problems, when I started off, like, I considered myself to be like a pretty good communicator. Like, I can communicate my ideas and I can understand what the other person is saying. And like, we have like almost 3 years into my PhD, like, I have like a fantastic communication rapport with the people I work with. But most of these times, like most of these problems that we try to work on, so like just last week we had like a brainstorming session of like how we can translate 3D images to 4D, like something like using structural MRI. Can we generate DTI images or like fMRI images, or maybe learn how these kind of mappings can help in migraine detection? And this was such a brainstorming idea. So it took us almost 3 hours of non-stop brainstorming because it was very hard for me to understand what is the clinical value. Like, let's say if I build up even a model that can do this, does this add a clinical value? Because yeah, like, to be honest, like AI models won't be great at, like, you cannot just synthesize a functional MRI scan that's like highly accurate that even humans can not find the like deformities over there. So what is the clinical value? And it took me more than 1 hour to really understand how people like neurologists really scan a fMRI scan when the person is to be diagnosed with migraine or not, or any kind of treatments are to be supposed to be recommended to that particular person. So I think like now, like when I started off my PhD, I felt like, okay, maybe just 6 months and I should be able to speak languages from both the sides. Coming from a background of technical expertise, I should be fairly competent with explaining AI models. But actually, as like the deeper I go into this field, I feel like someone like my professor who has like joint appointments as an engineer and also like a radiology professor, even it's very hard to communicate these ideas because most of these times, like we are working on topics that are least explored or maybe like in a development phase. So it's like the ideas are very abstract, and when two different disciplines talk on abstract level, it's very hard to communicate. So I think it's going to be a fantastic field for someone like you who can speak from both the angles and more like understanding from clinical clinical workflows is like much more important, because to be honest, like AI skills can be learned, but having that background of like the complicated workflows that clinical environments provide is really critical to understand. So yeah,
Yeah, I was just going to say that when you said about the speaking in abstract terms, that is the nail on the head. It was like you're in the room and you're thinking, everyone's talking on a high level, but we're not making an actual plan to put this into fruition. Like, and
yeah,
it's because you just can't, like, you can't get beyond the very superficial level if you don't, like, the doctors didn't have that understanding of what AI can achieve, what its limitations are. And on the flip side, the engineers or the software or research scientists had no idea about the complexity of the clinical workflows or the like how this actually translates to real patients. And often they imagine it as a lot more simple than it actually is in reality. But anyway, yeah.
yeah, nothing to add over there. Like, I completely agree to that particular point. And yeah, just to add, like, maybe I'll add one small note is like, most of the times I feel people are much more interested in the research component of a particular project to work on rather than its applicability. So as in, like, I would be much more interested building like a translation model, but I would maybe care a little bit less about does it have like a great impact and like helping someone who is really interested. So yeah, that's also something people should focus on. But yeah, I mean, it's a diverse world, so it's very hard to focus on that. But yeah, like I'm wondering, so like I think we talked at length, but do you have any kind of tips based on these kind of conversations? So like, do you have any tips for what are the best ways for people to have like interdisciplinary efforts being done at a very concrete level? So like, would you say how would you go forward? Like, let's say if you are setting up a research lab and you have your expertise and you hired a bunch of people, what are the pitfalls that you would, I mean, we already discussed a couple of them, but like, would you have any other further insights onto sharing, like maybe someone who is working in this field, what are the pitfalls to avoid so that we make actual contributions to the field that has some utility?
Yeah, so I mean, it sounds like the way that you're doing things is kind of the ideal, but like it's actually quite rare. Having spent, some time in this field where, you're kind of actually having meetings with clinicians and talking through your ideas. And I really think that ultimately that is the answer, although it doesn't make the meetings necessarily that easy initially. I think, yeah, I think if I could completely like I almost kind of want at the moment my focus has been more on the medical education side of things. So I think making sure that any doctor that graduates from a UK medical school has a cursory understanding of what AI is and what the tools are, and potentially sort of trying to push towards having a system where there's more recognition for clinicians with an interest in AI, and maybe have protected time for them to work with either companies or academic institutions working on developing AI tools, that we actually have like protected time for those doctors to be involved in that kind of thing. And whether, most ideal worldview could be that there's a nice sort of matching, like some organization that's going to match doctors to where they're needed. And that if you're a technical team, even maybe like a startup or like a small group starting out, that you can then get access, because I think access is a really big problem on the technical end, is that they just can't access like doctors, because doctors' time is already very, very pressured. They're very busy people generally, and they don't really have time to spend like a whole afternoon battling through a difficult conversation to try and work out what on earth like we're collectively trying to achieve here. Yeah. So I feel like I don't really have the answers because it's an unsolved problem at the moment.
Yeah,
But I would definitely encourage people to make sure that they have clinical input to any big project that they're undertaking, because otherwise, yeah, I just don't think that there's a realistic shot of having a meaningful clinical impact if you don't have doctors involved early, because then you could be sinking a lot of time into something that doesn't end up being useful.
makes sense. And I also wanted to also spend some time on your works, maybe trying to understand them more. So, can you tell? So, one of your works is using convolutional neural networks for predicting the length of stay in ICUs for patients. So, can you tell a little bit more on, like, since we talked about like understanding these problems from a ground level, like as in like from an application perspective, and then approaching AI solutions or AI techniques to solve a particular problem. So, can you tell a bit more about your work? Like, what was the background of that particular problem? And how did you approach, like how did you go on identifying a problem and then using AI, so scoping the world of AI and you like picking the right particular technique that can solve that particular issue?
Well, I feel like I kind of went back and forth from the different perspectives because initially, I think back in 2017 when I was starting my PhD, there were sort of very limited publicly available data sets that I could use to develop AI models. And doing a PhD in computer science means that I need to have a technical contribution. So I could never be so applied that I'm not, developing new methods. So that was always important. So I kind of started with what data is available. Okay, it looks like the best data is for ICU, which makes sense. Other than imaging, sorry, I should say that, because I felt like the imaging space is kind of was a bit more saturated than sort of time series. And I felt like my extra clinical knowledge, which is the only thing that I had to differentiate myself at the time, because I was far weaker on the technical elements, that I kind of had to make the best of that. And I felt like my understanding of physiological time series data, like how to interpret what blood pressure means in ICU, for instance, or other factors, that I would then need to use in order to give myself the kind of novel edge in terms of research. So I kind of started with what data is available. Okay, I have some data for ICU. Then can I think of the most scalable and perhaps underserved research problem? So that was when I went to go and speak to various consultants in ICU, so mainly two in Addenbrooke's, one of which I'm sort of closely collaborate with now. But basically, they suggested that bed management is a really big area, because if you can make bed management slightly more efficient, you end up making a big impact there, especially in a country like the UK, where we actually, and during COVID kind of made this hyper acute really, that we actually don't have very many intensive care beds per unit population in the UK. And that is also more the case in Europe than it is in the US. So actually, if you can, it's a like resource allocation problem where all of the there's enough demand that it's going to fill the supply that you have. So if you can perhaps discharge a patient a day sooner or something, you could potentially have very scalable impact. So that was the plan, was to work on problems that would help make allocation of beds more efficient. And then it also means that if it could work in maybe one ICU, you could then, replicate it in others. And because ICU has quite a high mortality, and also each bed is very expensive. It's about £2,000 per day to have a patient in intensive care, because it's one-to-one nursing staff and it's just very expensive. That we need to make sure that we allocate these fairly and most efficiently. So I worked on a problem which was to predict the length of stay of patients currently in intensive care, because if you know how long each patient's likely to stay, then you can then make sure that you're discharging them on time. Because if you're not anticipating that, then you're not going to sort out all their medication, move them from IV medication to oral medication. Things like that are very important. Taking them off of their ventilator appropriately, because they can't be on sort of invasive machines outside of ICU. So things like that. So that was the problem that I really focused on, which is to predict the length of stay of patients. Now, this isn't a totally new problem. There were people also working on it, but far fewer than who were working on mortality, because I think that was just the most simple task, is can you predict death? But actually death is just less useful than length of stay, really, in terms of the potential applications, because a lot of the time it's kind of the doctors already know that the patient's doing badly, but it's a harder problem predict their actual length of stay. It's a more nuanced problem than whether or not they're likely to survive. So I also predict mortality, by the way. It wasn't just length of stay, but length of stay was the main focus. And so what I did then was think, okay, how can I make my model the best model at solving this task? Because I can just deploy an LSTM or transformer, like a standard neural network to this problem, which I did do, and they did fine. But I thought, well, how do I make it better than that? And I think within medicine, the key at the moment, because we have limited data size, I feel like if you had enough data and the limit of infinite data, the transformer would probably do the best, or some fully connected, theoretically, the most flexible model would be the best. But in our case, I think it's mainly how can you use what you already understand about the data to help the model learn from the limited data that it has. So, for example, in medicine, we know that patients go to sleep and they wake up. So they have like periodic cycles. We know that they have meal times and they have drug schedules. So they might have their medication every 4 hours, which might change their physiological response to certain things, which we might basically see periodic cycles in their data. So actually, I think convolution makes a lot more sense, like dilated convolutions where we look at spaced samples, maybe a 24-hour spacing, maybe a 6-hour spacing, that kind of thing. But the idea is having these rigid filters where we're looking for patterns, so we can sort of extract trends over time that are more suited for purpose than just looking at one time step at a time, or in the case of transformer, having no expectation of structure whatsoever. So I think it was thinking about things like that, and it's not just periodicity, but there's other factors. Thinking about how to treat the missingness of the data, and how different parameters relate to each other as well is also important. Because, for example, a patient's blood oxygen could be high just because they're breathing in 100% oxygen. So it's important to sort of interpret each parameter in the context of the rest of the patient. So using all this knowledge of how medical time series behave, I then design this convolutional model to predict length of stay better. And to my knowledge, I think at the time it was the first sort of model that was really focused on convolution to solve that task. And we ended up doing a lot better than LSTM and transformer. So I think, so I ended up using like my medical knowledge of how I expect the data to behave to then give the model a sort of prime it to be able to pick these patterns up more easily than if it had no expectation of the structure whatsoever, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say I love that, as in like what you said about like you had a better understanding of what data you are gonna analyze or use it for the models, and then you moved on to choosing like a model which works best. And this has been like a constant struggle even for me, because most of the times we are posed with like some kind of data set that we want a very high level fruit, that we want like the end goal, but like having the details in between, like what exactly are we looking at, like what would a person with medical expertise would look at. So it's definitely we can tune down or maybe prune down certain aspects of this particular data set that can help me better design my AI experiments. So I love that. And maybe like one of the few things that I noticed even like when I was reading your works, like broadly speaking, I think most of these applications of AI in healthcare, they try to focus on two particular things. One is fixing or maybe improving existing gaps in the workflow or any kind of system that they have in medical background or medical settings. And secondly is more like discovery. So it's like basically using AI for discovering something novel. What you like in one of the earlier answers, you said something for early prediction, right? So it is something lesser known. So like at least for me, I know for Alzheimer's background, like I work with 3 groups who have different expertise and approaching Alzheimer's from a different perspective. They always say this one particular thing like early prediction, right? So like I was very curious and I attended like a couple of conferences. Alzheimer's Association, it's like a very big conference for people who are working on Alzheimer's research, and they actually showed like a couple of more than few particular interventions that can like these are coming from clinicians who have expertise working on these particular interventions, and they say if we have a better prediction, we at least have some shot. So it's basically like we are trying to explore, use AI to maybe explore something novel. I mean, it could be a dead end, like for sure it doesn't help. Like you said, like having early prediction for 2 years, it might not have any significant value, but it's more like they're trying to understand what's going on. Like experts would say, like, we do not have an understanding of what's going on. Like, for example, migraine, like I work with this group with Mayo Clinic, they really don't know what's going on in the brain. Like for Alzheimer's, you know that there are some kind of amyloid plaques that get deposited in your brain, and there are structural damages and blah blah. But that's at least good to know. Like we know what's causing this issue. But for migraine, it is least known. Like they don't even know what's happening. All they just know is like people suffer from pain. It's like some form of pain that's going on in your white matter. I mean, I could be butchering up the words that I'm using, but it's some kind of pain thresholds that go into your brain. So it's more like discovery. So I just wanted to highlight like what I love about your works, or at least few sets of works that you have done, is more like fixing the gaps that has like at least some definite interest from medical community, because we know these are the gaps that I see in this existing flow, and it aligns with your particular expertise because you have been working in this field, so you are the most eligible person to find these gaps. So yeah, just wanted to comment on that. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, that's okay. And I think just to say that I think I slightly neglected that side of things, because actually using AI to discover more or to improve our understanding of conditions is a super valid and exciting strategy, and is kind of one that I've taken in my most recent project as well. And just to say also that, just because let's say that we can't intervene at the moment, identifying patients early that might have interesting conditions could lead to new possibilities in studying them. And so this actually came up, I think, when I was at AAAI this year. Someone was presenting about identifying some kind of dementia early, and I think I said, they were under the impression that the clinical impact was that they would be able to identify these early and would be able to treat them. And so I think the real potential clinical impact could be for science, and the fact that you can recruit them earlier to study them in more detail. And that is itself a super exciting thing. But I think people need to have in their heads what it is that they're trying to achieve and be very clear about like the potential clinical impact. And yeah, what you said about migraine made me smile, because I remember learning about it in medical school, and they were like, we've got 3 hypotheses. We've got the vascular hypothesis. We've got the sort of like the one where like you've got a wave of depot. Like they have no idea what's going on. And same with paracetamol. We don't understand how paracetamol works, which is crazy. I think for anyone who's American, it's Tylenol that I'm talking about. We have a vague sense that there is a mechanism that it works via COX enzymes, but we don't actually really understand its pain, its analgesia effect. It's kind of puzzling still. So it's interesting. There's still major things that we have no idea about.
Yeah. That's one of the few things that really makes me excited about working on these projects, to be honest. Like I said, like I would be least interested if I'm using AI for recommendation algorithms, but it makes me more intrigued applying to these kind of domains, even if the research output is bad, but I'll be still more internally motivated. But yeah, talking about triple AI, so like I saw one of your recent works that you tweeted on Twitter is using outcome-based clustering algorithm for mechanically ventilated patients. So like I won't go into the details of explaining that. Like I'll leave it up to you. But like, can you maybe explain a little bit about your background? Like what does that particular problem entail, and how did you use, like, what kind of models made its way to fixing those gaps?
Yeah. So my interest in mechanical ventilation goes right back to my first year, because I've always been kind of interested in reinforcement learning. I just find it really cool, but I've never actually successfully done a research project in the area. And my first year of my PhD was kind of the story of my foray into reinforcement learning, despite the fact that I had no technical background. No one else in my lab was working towards it. So obviously I wasn't going to succeed, especially in a healthcare domain where the data is really noisy and just not like, but I did become very interested in mechanical ventilation because I realized having spoken to clinicians at the time for that project, that actually we don't have a clear sense of what we're doing with mechanical ventilation, because, for example, if someone's on a ventilator, the doctor will set certain parameters, like what pressure we're going to deliver the air into the patient's lungs, what sort of volume of expansion we're looking for. There's various settings, about 5 or 6 settings that you can play with. And really, every single clinician is going to set probably the ventilator slightly different for different patients, or maybe even the same patient. But there's not really a sort of established, optimized strategy at the moment. There's vague rules of thumb that we know, like you shouldn't give too much pressure because it damages the lungs. But actually, the amount that we don't really understand is quite shocking. And especially when you consider that the mortality of these patients on artificial ventilation is quite high, and they're very vulnerable, and their lungs are not in a good state. So surely it should matter what we're doing, and yet we don't really have a very good understanding. So at the time, I was trying to use reinforcement learning to, basically the action space would be to choose the various different parameters, and the reward would be some like maybe intermediate physiological state of the patient or something. But then I think by the time I'd actually done most of my PhD, I kind of was thinking a bit more realistic at the time, because I think anything more concrete that we're going to get from this, maybe sort of directing like clinical research trials to more promising directions, we might need to be a bit more simpler with the methods and a bit more kind of more concrete. So my most recent project aimed to basically cluster patients. So when I say cluster, I mean like assign a dynamic clustering, so that for each time point along the patient's stay, we have an idea of what kind of category of patient we're thinking about. And the reason why that problem is important is because the patients on mechanical ventilation, it's not just one group of people. You know, there are some that are on mechanical ventilation because they've had surgery, or they're unconscious, or they're recovering from an anesthetic or something. So they've got perfectly healthy lungs. And then we've got patients who've got really bad COVID or terrible pneumonia, and they just can't expand their own lungs because they're full of fluid and infection and things. And there'll be some that have chronic lung diseases, so it's more chronic than acute. And yeah, so we kind of wanted to be able to separate these patients into different clusters, have a look at the clusters in more detail, and particularly analyze, you know, if we can see where patients maybe change cluster. So maybe go from acutely bad subtype where the outlook is not good to healthy again, and maybe the reverse. And we also wanted, so maybe sort of that's a way to, you know, we're not doing causal modeling, but we're kind of getting at that, where we can start analyzing like where we're seeing these shifts in the patient's prognosis, and analyzing that in a bit more detail. So again, it's kind of like a bit more investigative, like where we don't necessarily know exactly what we're looking for, but we're trying to improve our understanding. And also, yeah, another thing that we're interested in is if we can subtype patients reliably, how early on in the patient's stay can we usually cluster the patient? So if we take aside any sort of unexpected event in the patient's stay, so not the patients where they look like they're going in one direction and then they change. Most patients kind of have a steady trajectory that's a bit more predictable. We want to know how early on we can identify that. And that's important because it would mean if we're going to do more personalized treatment strategies, let's say if we're going to develop more specialized protocols for what mechanical ventilation we should do, we need to be able to identify that patient early on so that we can then identify that cohort which we're specializing the technique for. So that's kind of the angle that we took. And yeah, so we kind of wanted to know, what do the different subtypes of patient look like, and can we reliably identify them early so that potential kind of interventional studies could generate that cohort super early and then trial different treatments on that specific group of people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. And I think one of the, like, just to add on that, like, I won't have anything add to on that particular project itself, but just to add something, what you said for subtyping, right? So that's also one of the key things that I have seen at least few works focus on. And one of the key things that we are going to publish very recently is this idea of using subtyping for understanding different trajectory of disease progression is something that we stumbled onto that. Like, to be honest, I wasn't expecting that in my results. So one of these things that what I'm using is using AI model to understand the aging effects in your brain. So we have, like, for my particular model, I'm using like a healthy cohort to build this model, and then we test out on 80 patients. But one of the key things that I noticed was I used some kind of metric to get the value of, like, what is the amount of aging effects in your brain. And I just plotted those results, and my only assumption was, like, I would be able to detect AD versus healthy patients, right? Like the very naive way of making a classification model. But one of the key things that we noticed was, so there are apparently there are these clinical categories that makes you go from being healthy to AD patients. So there are like MCI patients, which in terms of cognition, they fall somewhere in between being like a extremely AD patient versus being like a healthy patient. And there are something called MCI stable, MCI converting, MCI non-converting. So there are also people who classically, like, maybe might be labeled as MCI, but like so by the way, MCI stands for mild cognitive impairment. And like basically, if the patient did not suffer from those kind of cognition impairments, he will be converting back to healthy, like maybe acting more like healthy. And we actually saw like a very good subtyping trajectory from that aging effects that perfectly correlates to these 5 categories. So people who are converting back to healthy had the least amount of aging effects, versus people who are converting to AD, they had like more aging effects. And this was something like, it just relates to what you said for these particular things, as in like making or using these kind of techniques to subcluster or maybe like subtype these patients that we might not have an understanding for. So yeah, just to add on that, like I think it's a very valid topic to explore, like subtyping certain trajectories that people might not have an understanding for. So yeah.
Mm.
But yeah, I think we are close to the time, but I wanted to like get one opinion answer from you. Like, I think one of the earlier questions in one of the earlier questions you did answer is, people have been, oh, like the field of vision is like sufficiently explored in medical research, and something like language models is something very interesting. So I just wanted to maybe like poke your brain on, like, do you think at least tools like ChatGPT or any kind of generative models that are being, I think, talked a lot recently, is can be like, can they be really useful in clinical settings? Like, can you think of these kind of tools being used in clinical settings in any whatsoever ways? And I'm asking you because you have the most expertise of understanding these workflows. So at least would you like think from any kind of utility for these models?
I'm sure there are definitely uses to the models. I mean, anyone that's kind of had a play around with ChatGPT or GPT-4, like, can very quickly see how impressive it is. I think, and the speed of the progress as well is insane. I think, is it ChatGPT-4 can now pass the USMLE exam, which is the US medical licensing exam. But the interesting thing about that is that it only gets just above the pass mark, so it's like the level of a kind of bad student.
Yeah.
Kind of interesting, because I think from what I've observed, like playing around with it, it's almost like the outputs of the language models are super convincing. I feel like if you're not already an expert in the area, you could very easily be fooled by the answers that are given. Like, if you say, like, I don't know, what are the most interesting areas of frontiers of research in, I don't know, quantum computing or something more specific that I don't know anything about, it could give me something back and I think, wow, like, this is amazing. But actually, if you're an expert in that field, like I asked it about my own work, actually, and there are errors and inaccuracies in there. So I'm like, no, that's not right. That wasn't the main aim of that project. And, so you kind of notice things when you're an expert that it doesn't quite get right. So I feel like it's a little bit off being used sort of autonomously in any medical context. I feel like if I can't trust it for small things, I really wouldn't want to trust it to write a discharge summary or something yet. But I might be reevaluating that statement in only 6 months' time at this rate, because like it might be just as reliable in a year's time. There are definitely lots of text-based tasks that I feel like we that we have in medicine, and that waste a lot of doctors' time. I feel like, a lot of junior doctors are spending a lot of time writing up letters of what happened to a patient in hospital when they could be providing direct care to patients. And I feel like the past 30 years have seen a kind of movement away from doctors spending time talking to the patient, gathering information and examining, and more towards admin tasks. And I feel like AI is actually quite a cool opportunity, and particularly a lot of the language stuff as well, of moving away from that side of the job and back to its roots, actually. So yeah, I definitely think there's a role for it. I think it'll definitely take longer to filter into medicine because of the fact that the data is harder to access, and regulatory, that's another area that we haven't really talked about, but the regulations for AI to be deployed are totally unsuitable for purpose. Like, they actually use the medical devices legislation, which was kind of designed to regulate kind of implants for knee replacements and other things that you actually put in the body or you use, or it's not really built for software, especially as like something like AI software. You'd want to update it periodically with new data and like alter the way, and you'd have to there's no kind of provision for that. You kind of have to redo a lot of that, because if you're going to alter a component in a knee replacement, you need to fully get that new material kind of approved for use in the human body and that it's non-toxic, etc. But actually, so that's another topic. But so I think there will be delays in it being used because of interoperability issues, IT problems, and regulatory problems, and possibly ethics as well. There's no guarantee that the model's not going to be like. I think we've definitely seen examples of AI models being like, prejudiced in various ways, and we need to make sure that's not the case. But do I think it could have potential uses? Absolutely. There are probably far more potential use cases than I can even think of right now. And I think eventually we will see them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like rightly so, I think medical community has been the slowest adopter of AI technologies, and I'm pro for that. Like, that should be the thing. It should not be just easily adopted unless these tools are heavily matured enough to be used in these kind of settings, because it's a very high stake application domain. But yeah, I love that. I think I have been reading a lot of papers that are posted on archive that people have been using or proposing to use ChatGPT like models to maybe summarize clinical notes, or maybe like have like a very rough summary of like people, like let's say like you are a person who is maybe taking or making these clinical notes. It's a long list. I don't have the time to go through all of these. Like, when it goes to like someone senior or someone who is an expert, it kind of summarizes in his or her own way. So it's more like having like a standard trained model that can summarize few things in a standard template. How I do that, like, people can just train models like ChatGPT or fine tune these models, and then it can create a very concise summary. What does it mean? So that would be like a life-saving thing, something what you said for screening. So that would be like a very nice application. But like you said, like it will take a long time, at least few more years to go from there, someone trying it out, playing it out, and maybe failing those and reporting those results of failure. So but yeah, it's surely interesting. It's something on a new chartered domain, so it would be hopefully improving the practice.
I wish it would come in slightly sooner, because I'm due to be a junior, and so I'm going to be the ones writing up the letters of what happened. And I wish I could just send it to ChatGPT, or like medical. Maybe there'll be a medical GPT or something in the future. Anyway.
Yeah, I think I posted like a post on LinkedIn sometime back, like as in like I was inviting someone who has worked on ChatGPT, and like I posted like a LinkedIn post saying that, do you have any questions? Like, do you have like the audience has any questions that I can ask this particular person that I might be missing? And someone actually DM'd me saying that, why don't you ask ChatGPT? And he actually posted a photo of like a query into ChatGPT saying like, I'm inviting an inventor of ChatGPT, what questions I should ask. And that ChatGPT gave me 15 questions, and there were like more than 10 questions that I didn't even think of. And I was like, damn, that's impressive now. Like, I haven't been a fan of ChatGPT for a long time, but that particular instance, and I was like, okay, I need to explore more so that I'm not left out on the, the creative ideas that might be out there in the world. So yeah, it's impressive. Yeah.
And programming as well, like asking it to write certain program. Like, I've already used that, and that is amazing. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's completely fine. Yeah, that's something I need to explore more. Yeah. But I wanted to squeeze in a last question, and maybe this also relates to one of the things that you bookmarked in one of the answers that we talked about in the earlier conversation, is the talking more about your academic life, or maybe like a researcher career. So there's always a tendency of like an overwhelming need to publish stuff, and something like what you said, like there is a whole game of like people just trying to publish out stuff. It might not have any sense, or it might not have any actual impact, but they are just exploring and publishing. And it's now more than ever, it's very hard to compete with these people who are in the AI giants field, right? So like it's like, to be honest, like I post lesser on Instagram, but I still see more people publishing on archive. It's like very, very hard to keep up with people who are pushing out stuff that works on AI and any kind of interdisciplinary field. So first of all, I wanted to ask question is like, do you feel overwhelmed by the kind of works being done in AI field? And secondly, what would you say about about that particular factor, that in order to make like a good research thesis, so that you go out in the industry or academia, you make up a good profile for a research career? Is it true that we need more papers, more like just the quantity of work over quality of work nowadays? Is that the sad reality? So like, what are your comments on these two particular things? Like, maybe you can interconnect them if you want.
Yeah, I do feel like the incentive to publish is very strong. Like, I mean, at the moment it is getting more and more competitive, and it feels like people are demanding quantity and sort of quality. When I say sort of quality, I mean like they want them at like NeurIPS, ICML, like iClear venues or whatever. And and they want kind of like 1 or 2 papers a year kind of thing, or even more in some groups, which is crazy. And I think just if that's the way that you're working, it kind of means that you can't really drill down and take the time into really solving meaningful problems and involving clinicians, because all of that is going to take more time, and you're going to probably invest more into a single project in order for that to happen. I think for me, like initially, did I feel overwhelmed? Yes. Like in the group that I'm in as well, I felt like I just wasn't on the same level as everyone else. I didn't publish as much as everyone else in my PhD group. But I think later on, I kind of had more, I allowed myself to rely on the confidence that I'm building up a skill set that is in demand. I think try not to lose sight of why you're doing what you're doing and what your end goal is. Like my end goal was to have a career in research where I'm contributing meaningfully and using my skills to the best of my ability to impact patients at scale, hopefully in the future. And so I knew that I was investing this time to develop skills, which are going to then allow me to do that later on. And if that means that I'm not publishing in sort of these big conferences every year, that seemed okay to me at the time later on. And I think kind of if you dial back 50 years, they didn't really have that. It was more than okay to only publish once in your PhD. And it still is, I think, in some domains. If you look back into maybe biology or more experimental areas, it is like anyone who gets one Nature publication, which took 4 years of effort, is well worth that time. And that is more impact maybe than having 6 papers in your PhD, yeah. Which, and just because something is cited a lot as well, doesn't mean that it's a massive contribution, which, it's also like, this is how we measure these things. And back to the question of like, is this what people should be doing? It's really tough, because I feel like if people are trying to get competitive postdoc positions and, next stage, like a lot of the time, that is the way that people are going to whittle down candidates. And so you kind of have to play this game, but it's not your fault that that is the way that the system is set up. But if you want to succeed in the existing system, there's an element that you kind of have to work within it. And I feel like for me, it's kind of a bit easier because there are very few people with my skill set. And so I feel like even if I don't have the same publication record as someone else, it kind of matters less because I don't really fit the mold anyway. And if you're a MB PhD student, it's easier because of your medical side to still get those positions in certain institutions, even if you don't have the same, because they don't expect it, because you're not spending all of your time doing research. So yeah, I would encourage people to try not to lose sight of impact, but also I get that people are incentivized to become publishing machines. Just kind of sad.
Yeah. I think that I was applying to some position. I forgot. Like, I don't want to take any names for the big companies, but I honestly don't remember like which company it was. Like, and they have like an eligibility requirement that you should be having like at least 3 papers in a brackets of triple AI, NeurIPS, CVPR, and something. And that was just for an internship. And I was like, damn,
Yeah.
that's like, and that's really hard. I mean, but to be honest, like I have seen a lot of students who are also publishing in this particular domain. So it's like the bar is very high than ever. It's like very hard to get into these kind of internships, and internships are like very, at least for PhD students, it's like one of a few openings. It's like they don't have as much opening as like you have like for software engineers. So it's like very competitive for people to get into these. But just looking at like having that particular thing in your eligibility requirements, it made me strike out that, oh wow, that's something maybe I need to focus also my efforts on. Like what you said, it's like a balance of like, yes, I should be focusing more on impact, but it's at least I need to learn how to play the game itself to maybe stand out or maybe do whatever I want to do. So yeah, that makes sense. At least it's good to know that at least someone feels the same way. So yeah, it's really interesting than ever. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to end like maybe just like get one short question in is like, do you have any tips for people? And the reason I ask for tips is for people like I at least know a few people who are in the audience that might be interested like or might be working in an interdisciplinary field. And if you want to pick up, you can also pick up like the healthcare domain. What kind of tips would you give to people who are building up their career, trying to be on that particular bridging gap like you are? So you're bridging 2 particular domains. What are kind like overall, like we talked a lot about the pitfalls that maybe people can avoid and advices you shared, but like overall, do you have any kind of advice for people who are starting off and feeling overwhelmed by 2 particular fields? Like you said, like you want like there are chances like you're like jack of all master of none kind of scenarios, but like when you're starting out this field, what kind of advice would you give to those people?
Yeah, so I think I would encourage people as much as possible to be bold in your decision making. And for me, that meant constantly putting myself out of my comfort zone. So once I was a medical student, I was comfortable as an undergraduate medical student. Then I go into 3rd year engineering, and I'm now in a course where I haven't done the first 2 years. Everyone else has. I'm like, like, yeah, it feels like you kind of suddenly in a very unfamiliar environment. And then again, putting myself in a position where I'm in a computational group, and that's not at all my background. But I think the rationale behind that is, okay, I feel like I have access to the medical side of things now. I know, I don't know everything, far from it. I'm very junior, but I know how to go about getting that expertise. I don't know anything about the computer science side. So I should put myself in a lab where I'm the only one who has come from this background, and they all have the background that I'm aspiring to, because then, I can chat to people. I have so much more access to all this area that I know nothing about. So I think that was key because, I had a choice at that point. I could have applied for a kind of computational clinical informatics type PhD where I could have been the main technical person in a medicine-based lab, and I could be exploring that interest by myself. But surely that would be far less immersive than putting myself in a position of, uncertainty and being amongst people that have that expertise that I want to gain. And I think that's really important. So I would say, no matter what it is you're doing, like, if you want to become, you're interested in entrepreneurial stuff, or or you're coming from a technical background but you want to move into healthcare, like try and put yourself in as much situations as possible where you're surrounded by people with the expertise that you want to gain a mentor specifically in the field that you're not comfortable in, rather than the one that you're coming from. And for me, like I initially had two PhD supervisors, one in clinical and one in technical, and like I think that's also important, but also make your primary supervisor, your primary lab, in the area that you don't already know anything about. So that would be my, if you're not feeling like you've got imposter syndrome, or you're not feeling like you're out of your comfort zone, I feel like that is a sign that maybe you should be pushing yourself. I mean, yeah, like hopefully once I settle into my career and I kind of end the skill building phase, I won't need to feel like that all the time. But because it's a less comfortable place to be. But I think once you're trying to build your skill set, it's a good sign to just constantly put yourself in, less comfortable situations.
Yeah, and most of the things, I think when you're working on these research projects, it's much more about the creative aspect of working on these problem solving domains, right? So like how much you can be creative about picking out a problem and then tackling it with the best knowledge that you have. And in those cases, like what you said makes sense, like and putting out in an uncomfortable domain, or maybe like what you said is like having a mentor that is like outside of your field, or maybe like something you are trying to hone your expertise in, and then he or she might be able to comment more, and that will at least make you like a better contributor to that particular problem, rather than what you had like the comfort zone. Like if you are a technical person, like hey, that's what you're gonna specialize on. But like the beauty happens is when you try to figure out these intersecting or overlapping domains. So yeah, that makes sense. That's a lot nice to hear. So that's good to you. Thanks for sharing. But yeah, I think that's all I have. Like we are fairly over the time, but I think we had some very nice discussions over from your background to talking about like the broad spectrum of AI and medical research, which I think is really exciting to learn from. Few things that I learned from you, like someone from who is like a clinical background. So thanks for sharing all these insights. Hopefully they are also as interesting for people who are listening to this particular podcast. So once again, thanks for being here. It was a great podcast, great conversation, and hoping to have you maybe sometime later once you join as an academic doctor. It would be fun to have much more deeper insights into how that particular field looks like and how the landscape of AI looks from a different perspective. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.